Listeners, and to any of those who give feedback. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, that you can log in and give us your messages via text or via the chat room here on the various platforms. And don't forget that you can also call in live to have your say, not only on Lethbridge local matters, but also matters of national interest here in Canada and around the world. And with that said, we've got some breaking news just coming in about Donald Trump's Board of Peace. Yes, he has invited about 50 different world leaders in to join this. And if you have the privilege of joining him after paying a $1 billion entry fee, you can be a member of the Board of Peace. Now, it has just come out that Trump's feelings are hurt because of this speech that Mark Carney gave while in Davos over in Switzerland. Yes, Mark Carney was the talk of the world, not just the town, but the world, after an amazing, very articulate speech where he called out Donald Trump on all of his bullshit and all of the other crap that Donald Trump has been pressuring the world, whether that has to do with the 10% tariffs in Greenland, whether or not it has to do with any of these other things going on within the world and Trump's little whatever you want to call that his mind is at, because it sure as hell isn't in the same world as the rest of us. However, with that said, Mark Carney called out Donald Trump. He announced to the world that this is not a recalibration. This is a whole new era for the world. And with that said, of course, as I said, Donald Trump was inviting different world leaders to join his Board of Peace. However, it has just broken that Donald Trump has withdrawn his invitation to Mark Carney. Yes, Mark Carney hurt the Orange Buffoon's feelings and now has been uninvited to join this fraudulent Board of Peace. And we'll get into that in tonight's episode. We are going to be talking about the history and the future of sovereignty when it comes to the Arctic. That's in Canada, that's in Greenland, and elsewhere. We're also going to talk about Donald Trump's idiotic statements that he doesn't want Russia to take over Greenland because he doesn't want Russia as a neighbor. And yet, if you go north and look off the coast of Alaska, he's already a bloody neighbor of Russia. This guy has no clue as to what the hell he's talking about. The speech that he delivered at Davos was self-gratifying, self-enhancing, and at the end of the day was almost a word-for-word repeat of his State of the Presidency address that he made on the 20th after his first year in office. So just unbelievable. And then he kept mixing up Greenland and Iceland within his speech. And Caroline Leavitt, the bargain basement Barbie that's at the White House in the press office, is saying that he did not mix them up, that he was just referring to Greenland as a big block of ice. And really, I mean, at least a big block of ice is more than what is apparently between the ears of that U.S. president. Now, let's move on here, folks. We are going to forego tonight's local and national stories, and we're going to jump right into this specific topic tonight of Arctic sovereignty, Trump at the world stage, and of course this fraudulent Board of Peace. And you'll know what I'm talking about in just a few minutes when we start looking at that in a bit more depth. Now, of course, Arctic sovereignty in the 2026 Greenland crisis, it is a geopolitical realignment, a domestic deflection, and the rise of the Board of Peace. We are going to take an in-depth look here, and we're going to be looking at how this is being used to not only deflect what's going on in Israel and Gaza and all of the financial frauds and everything else that's going on, but also the Epstein files. Nobody's forgotten about the Epstein files as much as Donald Trump wishes they would. However, this has been another distraction from the global release of the Epstein files, as well as other issues that, of course, are of importance to Americans and on the global stage. Now, Just for clarification, in a trade war, I've seen some people commenting on my posts asking why we don't just flick the switch and turn off the power to the United States. Well, because of the simple fact that it's not just shutting off the lights. If we were to turn off the switch for electricity and power to the US, that would impact seniors' homes. It would impact life saving machines that are keeping people alive. It would impact hospitals. It would result in the loss of life. And unlike the United States president, here in Canada, we don't believe in unnecessarily injuring, let alone killing, foreign citizens or even our own. And that is why we do not act recklessly and put lives at risk or take the lives of our citizens, let alone those of other nations, without just cause. Now, when we look at this geopolitical landscape of the Arctic, though, it's transitioned from a period of historically defined big north low tension into a modern theater of intense great power competition. At the heart of this transformation is the Kingdom of Denmark's long-standing sovereignty over Greenland. This is a relationship that was established in 1776. Now, when Denmark assumed a trade monopoly and restricted foreign access to the island, that was 1776, folks. The sovereignty was maintained throughout the shifts of the 19th and the 20th centuries, surviving the strategic demands of the Cold War and the decolonization movements that reshaped global governance. In 1953, Denmark formally ended Greenland's colonial status, incorporating the island as a country and granting its inhabitants Danish citizenship. The adoption of the Home Rule Act in 1979 and the subsequent Self-Government Act of 2009 marked the milestones in Greenland's pursuit of autonomy, granting the local government control over internal affairs and mineral resources, leaving foreign policy and defense under the purview of Copenhagen. So let that sink in. That means that Trump does not have carte blanche to go in there and rape them for their raw minerals, for their rare earths, for anything else. Now, Canada's involvement in the Arctic is similarly rooted in deep historical claims to the Arctic archipelago. Now, the Northwest Passage is also an important aspect of this claim. Now, the maritime routes connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans are viewed by Ottawa as internal waters. This is a position that has frequently necessitated diplomatic maneuvering to maintain international recognition. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization has historically served as the security guarantor for these claims, with 7 of the 8 Arctic nations, which we are looking at: Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, of course, via Greenland, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. Now, currently holding membership are all of these in the alliance. This creates a nearly contiguous Arctic shield. That excludes only Russia, which possesses over 40% of the Arctic coast. Now, we could argue whether or not Trump is just a puppet of Putin, but we'll get into that later. Let's take a look, though, at the milestones in Arctic governance and sovereign evolution. Now, in 1776, it was Danish sovereignty. They launched the establishment of the trade monopoly. Now, what did that do? That restricted foreign access to Greenlandic resources. In 1916, there was a treaty, the U.S.-Denmark Treaty, where the U.S. purchased the West Indies from the Danes. The U.S. pledged at that time not to object to Danish interest in Greenland. Once again, this is a historical, over 100-year agreement that Trump is trying to just brush aside as if it never existed. Keep in mind now, those West India Islands, which are now known as the U.S. Virgin Islands, one of those was also Epstein Island. Imagine that for Donald Trump. The irony is there. Now, in 1941, the defense of Greenland, of course, was under Denmark now. the U.S. military base establishment. So the U.S. also came in 1941 to help protect Greenland, especially when it became, vital towards fighting the Nazi Germany. Very important key aspect. Now, of course, as the Germans took over Denmark, the U.S. acted as a custodian and protected Greenland while using it as as I said, a shield towards going after the Nazis from Germany. Now, this was as a custodian or as a partner, essentially. They never had possession. And that's something that Donald Trump fails to understand and recognize as well. The U.S. never had possession of Greenland. It was never the U.S.'s to give back, as Trump claims. Now, in 1951, as I said, there was the U.S.-Denmark Agreement, and that is where the NATO-aligned base authorization came in. It formalized the U.S. presence at Pidifik, whatever the name is. That's the Space Force base now that is in Greenland and Thule. Now, this is a big deal because, of course, we also know that there were many other bases located in Greenland that were set up and established by the U.S. and were essentially U.S. territory in terms of their leases, not ownership. Now, this was a partnership that not only protected Greenland, but also gave the military advancement and advantage to the U.S. and to NATO partners. This still, to this day, protects the Greenlandic people, the Danes, and, of course, NATO as a whole. Now, Trump, in his speech the other day, claimed that, of course, he doesn't think that NATO partners would be there to back up and to help the U.S. if that call was ever made. However, it should be very clearly noted that this idiot doesn't seem to remember 9/11, the only time that Article 5 through NATO has ever been invoked. And that was when the NATO partners all came to the aid of the United States and went into Afghanistan. The NATO partners lost lives, but they came to the aid of the U.S. without hesitation, without question. So for him to insult not only here in Canada, but other leaders and other countries and other veterans and those who lost their lives is just disgusting. Now, in 1953, it was the end of colonial status for Greenland. The integration as an integral Danish part of the Danish county and country, the Greenlanders gained Danish citizenship and representation. So that was a big point. And then we jumped to 1979, as I said, in the introduction of the Home Rule Act. And that was the establishment of their local government. That was a transfer of internal competencies from Copenhagen to Nuuk. And that is a big point of their independence. Now, jump ahead to 1985, and they withdrew from the EEC. And that was the departure from the European community, and Greenland became an overseas country and territory, which gave it more autonomy. Now, in 2009, of course, the Self-Government Act, which gave them their control over the minerals and natural resources that are there in Greenland. Again, they belong to the Greenlandic people, not to Trump, and they are not up for sale or negotiation. The U.S. government and U.S. corporations have the ability to go in and work with the Greenlandic people and the Danes to be able to explore and to bring to market those rare earth minerals or other minerals. They don't need to take it over. However, that is one of the concerns, is that Trump just wants to get his foothold in there so that he can take over, and he thinks that he will then own all of those minerals, all of those resources, whether it's oil and gas or rare earths or anything else. Now, that is, of course, not the intent of what the Greenland was achieving and what Denmark had planned. They were giving them a pathway to future independence. They weren't giving a pathway for Trump decades later to come in and try to take over. Now, as most recently as 2024, of course, there was the EU diplomatic office, the opening of European Union office in Nuuk. That strengthened the EU-Greenland strategic partnership. And it should also be noted that other countries are looking at opening their presence with diplomatic offices as well. And this, again, we will see why that's important. And when we look at the historical importance of those sovereignty claims, it has been amplified by the rapid melting of the Arctic ice, which is opening up previously inaccessible shipping routes and rendering mineral extraction more cost effective. Unlike Trump's speech the other day, you don't have to dig through hundreds of miles of ice or hundreds of feet of ice to get to it. It's quite exaggerated from his point of view, but it doesn't matter. As the gateway, though, for the Russian Northern Fleet and the transit point for the Northwest Passage, Greenland has become a focal point for security interests of the United States, China, and the European Union. This strategic gravity set the stage for an unprecedented event that have unfolded here in early 2026 and, of course, throughout last year. Now, the norm based order of Arctic governments was challenged by the direct annexation threats of the United States. Right now, of course, Trump came to or showed up at Davos in Switzerland for the World Economic Forum and brought with him demands and his demands and his desire to take Greenland, which shortly thereafter changed. And he said that there was a framework of an agreement and all kinds of bullshit that Trump usually spouts, basically trying to save face. And I think that what had truly happened is that world leaders called him out on it and just face to face told him that this is got to stop. There's absolutely no way that Trump is ever going to get Greenland. They are a sovereign nation that deserves respect, something that Trump doesn't seem to give any nation right now. He continues to put out these silly Truth Social posts and other memes that have the U.S. flag blanketing Canada, the U.S., Greenland, Mexico, and other areas. I mean, it's just ridiculous that what he's doing. It's also insulting to the allies that have worked together for over 80 years and, without justification or cause. He is just mentally incapable of being the leader the world needs at this time. Now, as I said, in January this year, of course, the administration of Trump launched an aggressive campaign to secure Greenland as an American territory, citing the national security concerns as the primary justification. Now, this Greenland crisis was characterized by the rapid escalation of threats, starting with the assertion that the United States would take control of the island one way or the other. Now, he did recently at Davos take off the table for now the use of military force or taking it by force. However, we know from the history of Donald Trump that his words mean absolutely nothing. In December, he stated that he was not going to do aggressive maneuvers towards Venezuela right before he attacked them and kidnapped their president and first lady. Right or wrong, the point is that he breached the sovereignty and broke international law by doing that. And, I'm not saying that Maduro is a good guy. I'm not saying that Maduro didn't have to go, but I'm saying that the manner in which it was executed was against international law and breached sovereignty of a foreign nation. Now, how do we argue with Russia when it comes to Ukraine? How do we argue with China when it comes to Taiwan? How do we set an example as leaders in the world when we allow the U.S. to have carte blanche and do whatever they want outside of the rule of law? And that's where the world leaders need to step up. They need to start taking a tougher stance on Trump, and they need to do that now. Now, this is, of course, going on and on and on, and it goes back and forth. He's recently threatened the 10% tariffs to the any countries that don't surrender the idea of the U.S. having Greenland. And then again, yesterday, he dismissed those tariffs once again. So it's on again, off again with Donald Trump. You never know what you're going to get. And I don't think neither do any of the people that truly work with him. Now, the administration argued that Denmark was incapable of defending the territory against Russian or Chinese occupation, despite the long-standing bilateral agreements that allow for expanded U.S. military presence on the island. He went even further, insulting the people of Greenland and of Denmark, claiming that they have two dog sleds for a military protection there, and only one that was added recently. So again, it was just ridiculous. His insults and his ignorance is just off the chart. Now, the crisis reached a peak on January the 17th, just last week, when Trump announced his intention to impose that 10% tariff we were just talking about on imports from the key allies, which were including Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the UK, and also hinted at Canada. And that was unless a deal was reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. Now, these tariffs were scheduled to increase to 25% by June the 1st if U.S. demands were not met. The use of economic coercion against treaty allies was widely condemned as naked aggression and a form of hybrid warfare that threatened the very foundation of the NATO alliance. Let's not forget, folks, that the rest of the world, whether it's Europe, Canada, and others, don't need to send missiles. They don't need to launch aircraft. They just need to start cashing in the U.S. Treasury bonds that are held by foreign nations. It would cripple the U.S. economy. It would make it hard for them to fight a war when they have no money. And that could collapse the U.S. economy to a point that would be much worse than even the Great Depression. And that is a truth and a reality that Trump doesn't seem to really want to give or understand or accept. Now, in terms of this escalation that we're looking at, on January the 8th, the national emergency consideration was going on. Trump considered declaring an economic emergency to impose those tariffs once again. Now, January the 14th, the threat against Denmark. Trump's claim Denmark can do nothing if Russia or China invades Greenland, which is bullshit because they have the backing of NATO, which, believe it or not, is supposed to include the U.S. Now, January the 17th, there was the tariff proclamation, the announcement of 10% tariffs on 8 European nations. On January the 18th, NATO joint statement, allies reaffirmed Arctic security as a shared interest. On January the 19th, Operation Arctic Endurance, European military staff deployed to Greenland as a tripwire force. January the 20th, of course, there was the digital posture. Trump posts the AI images of himself planting a flag in Greenland. And then January the 21st, the Davos pivot. Trump ruled out military force and reached a framework deal with Mark Rutte, who is the head of NATO. And then January the 22nd, which is today, the EU Emergency Summit. Yes, the European leaders have met in Brussels to discuss transatlantic relations. They are not going to continue putting up with the bullshit from Donald Trump and his administration. They're tired of it. The whole world is tired of it. It's bouncing markets all over, economic impacts, trade impacts. It is just creating an unstable world, but handing benefits to people like Netanyahu, to Putin, and others. Now, when we look at the resolution of the immediate crisis that occurred at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where a meeting between the president and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte led to the rescinding of the tariffs. While the administration claimed a really fantastic deal had been reached involving the Golden Dome missile defense system and mineral rights, Greenlandic and Danish officials remained skeptical, asserting that Greenland is not for sale and that no deal altering the island's sovereignty was on the table. Analysts suggest that this is a retreat driven by European solidarity, negative market reactions. Let's remember that this has cost the U.S. markets over $1 trillion over several days, and that is a result of Trump. Now, there's also the domestic political pressure. Many in politics and citizens of the United States, as well as business leaders, are calling them out on it and telling them that this is a non-starter. That is the reality that we're seeing. Now, of course, there's also the strategic deflection. Is there actually anything to the Greenland rhetoric, or is it strictly the nexus of Arctic threats and domestic criminality? A prevailing theory among political analysts is that the intensity of the 2026 Greenland campaign served as a calculated ploy to deflect attention from burgeoning legal and criminal crises within the U.S. executive branch. That is important, ladies and gentlemen, because we know that Trump has been doing everything that he can to cover up these Epstein files, to cover up other things. Now, during the same period that the administration was threatening its allies, it was also facing extreme public pressure regarding the release of the Epstein files. That is, as everybody knows, a collection of records relating to the sex trafficking investigation of Jeffrey Epstein and the links to Donald Trump and others. Now, reports of infighting between Attorney General Pam Bondi and FBI Deputy Director Dan Bongino over the handling of these files has begun to erode the administration's political capital among its core supporters. Now, the administration's rhetoric regarding Greenland allowed it to shift the news cycle away from the Epstein investigation, and let's not forget the testimony of former special counsel Jack Smith. Smith is appearing before the House Judiciary Committee, stated that his investigation had developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the president engaged in criminal activity, specifically in his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results. He did so by manufacturing an international crisis over national security in the Arctic. The administration was able to frame its legal battles as distractions from the bold goal of territorial expansion. Let's also look that Trump today went to Truth Social and X and everywhere else, going on about the crookedness of Jack Smith, and he wants the DOJ to target Jack Smith, and typical weaponization of the U.S. legal and justice system to go after anybody that threatens Trump's narrative, his policies, his ideas, or him personally, because let's face it, we know he's in these Epstein files up to his neck, and that's one hell of an ugly neck. Now, when we look at this, let's look at the parallel tracking of international crisis and domestic legal blowback. The Greenland annexation threat. What was the domestic legal pressure? The Epstein file disclosures. That shifting base focus from the client list to territorial context. Then we have the other crisis management element, which was the tariff war against allies. That was meant to distract away from the domestic legal pressure of the Jack Smith testimony, dominating headlines with economic drama to drown out the criminal activity proof. Then, of course, you have the Board of Peace launch. That was a domestic legal pressure in the form of the New York civil fraud penalty, rebranding the administration as a peace builder while appealing $515 million in fines. So you want to ask why it is that he's trying to distract from all of these news stories? I think that it gets clearer. Now, of course, you have the Arctic militarization claims. And that is the emoluments investigation that he's trying to distract you from. He's invoking national security to justify executive power amid foreign payment scandals, folks. It is the biggest corruption and criminality in the U.S. political circle and the White House ever in the history of the United States of America. Now, the use of conspiracy theories to maintain power is a documented strategy of this current administration. By labeling the Epstein files a radical left-inspired hoax and simultaneously promoting a national security imperative in Greenland, the president effectively polarized the public discourse. He's ensuring that his base remained focused on perceived international triumphs rather than domestic criminal liability. This deflection extended to the president's family and their fraudulent activities, which were frequently contrasted with the administration's self-proclaimed Board of Peace initiative. Then we have the Russian variable, the pacification of Putin and the fragmentation of NATO, ladies and gentlemen. The timing and nature of the Greenland threats have raised serious questions about the administration's relationship with the Russian Federation. Analysts suggest that the attack on NATO allies over Greenland represents a continuation of the administration's pacification of Vladimir Putin. By threatening the territorial sovereignty of a NATO member, of course, Denmark, we're referring to, the United States effectively undermined the core principles of Article 5, the Mutual Defense Pact, that an attack on one is an attack on all. If the U.S. were to forcibly annex Greenland, it would shatter the legal and the moral foundation of the alliance, playing directly into Russia's long-term goal of fracturing the Western security architecture. Now, the invitation to Putin to join this fraudulent board of peace further underscores the trend of strategic alignment with Moscow. While the administration was bullying democratic allies like France and Germany with punitive tariffs, it was offering Russia a seat at a new, non-UN aligned diplomatic table. Putin's response that Greenland's value was comparable to the sale of Alaska and was of no concern to Russia. That showcases a shared view of land as a tradable commodity rather than as a sovereignty issue. Now, when we look at the implications for the transatlantic alliance and the Russian strategic goals, we can look at Article 5 destabilization. The threat of U.S. military action against Denmark represents the first time a major NATO power has openly threatened to annex the territory of a fellow member. This is creating an existential crisis for collective defense. Then you have the next point, which is strategic distraction. While the U.S. was preoccupied with the Greenland dispute, Russia continued its military de-escalation in the Arctic post-1991, only to pivot back to a significant buildup, securing its own supply lines and northern sea route. The Board of Peace is the next point, and that is a slap at NATO. Experts have warned that including Russia in a new peace-building body while sidelining NATO allies serves as a direct blow to the coherence of Western defense. Weakening of the Arctic Shield is the other point that we need to be concerned with. The internal conflict between the U.S. and the Nordic countries, as well as Canada, distracts from the recent integration of Finland and Sweden into NATO, which was intended to counter Russian aggression. This perceived pacification of Russia is seen by many as a method for the president to secure his own geopolitical legacy through a new world order that favors bilateral deals between autocrats over multilateral treaties. By undermining the United Nations and NATO, the administration creates a power vacuum that Russia and China are eager to fill, all while framing the retreat from global norms as American first victories. When we look at the Board of Peace, it's an autocratic alternative to global governance. The Board of Peace was formally launched in the 2026 Davos Summit, presented as a new international body for resolving global conflicts. Originally, it's conceived to manage the reconstruction of Gaza. The board's founding charter reveals a far-reaching mandate with international legal personality. This aims to undertake peace-building functions worldwide. The governance structure of the BOP is markedly different from existing international organizations such as the United Nations and appears designed to project the personal power of its chairman. One of the most controversial aspects of the Board of Peace is the duration and the nature of its leadership. The charter specifically names Donald J. Trump as the inaugural chairman, with no mention of a fixed term. He can be there as long as he wants. A U.S. official confirmed that the chairmanship can be held by the president until he resigns it, meaning he could remain at the head of the global body even after his presidential term ends. This chairman for life status provides a mechanism for ongoing influence over world affairs, potentially allowing him to control the $1 billion membership fees and the strategic direction of the international interventions indefinitely. When we look at this in terms of its governance model, let's look at the Board of Peace versus the United Nations. The governance model of the UN is a multilateral General Assembly. The governance model of a Board of Peace is an autocratic, chairman-centric organization. And let's not forget that the chairman is the only one that has veto power. So Trump can veto anything, even after he is no longer president of the United States. The leadership term for NATO is fixed at a 5-year term. For the Board of Peace, it's indefinite for the inaugural chairman. And will that mean that he will it or send it on down the line to his sons or his son-in-law, or who knows? The membership cost is proportional and assessed dues when it comes to the United Nations. But for the Board of Peace, everybody needs to give Trump $1 billion cash for a permanent seat. When it comes to veto powers, again, the United Nations is limited to the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council. Why do you think we can't get shit done when it comes to the U.S.? Because they veto any actions that investigate or are geared towards holding them responsible for their actions, and the same with Russia and the other permanent 5 members. Now, the veto power on the Board of Peace is absolute for the chairman. Donald Trump decides what vetoes are going to be enforced. That he can issue the vetoes, has all the veto power. If you don't think that he's going to be selling vetoes, then you've got your head in the sand. Just setting him up for just another international and unconceivable level of corruption. When you look at the geographical focus, of course, we know that the United Nations is a global organization, whereas the geographical focus on the Board of Peace is supposed to be hemisphere-centric. It's supposed to be related to the Western Hemisphere. However, what does that mean? Well, it obviously is not, because you're looking at the Middle East in terms of the majority of people who have so far committed to joining or have given strong interest. You have Russia, you have Belarus. Now, also, don't forget that Russia has not said yes yet. However, they are exploring it, provided the $1 billion is paid from monies that have been frozen assets inside the United States as a result of their actions on Ukraine. That $1 billion should not be going to a Board of Peace. That $1 billion should not be going to the Trump Organization or Donald Trump. It should be going to the people of Ukraine to rebuild that nation after the destruction, the chaos, and the death that the Russian government and the Russian Federation has caused to the people of Ukraine. That $1 billion that's frozen assets in the U.S. is not supposed to be used for Vladimir Putin to go in and join the frickin' Board of Peace. What is the world doing here? Now, the membership structure of the BOP also serves a transactional goal, linking permanence on the board to a massive financial contribution. Member states are granted 3-year terms by invitation, but those who pay $1 billion in cash within the first year are exempt from this limit. Again, Trump wants to ensure that these $1 billion payments come in, and it's incentivized to come in while he is still able to pilfer it. Plain and simple. He wants to use it in Gaza, but you know what he's going to do? He's going to use it to finance Gaza that he and Kushner and other people within his circle are going to own. It's not going to benefit the people of Gaza. It's not going to benefit Americans. It's not going to benefit the world. It's going to benefit Donald J. Trump and his circle of cronies. Member states are granted the 3-year terms by invitation, folks. As long as they pay that $1 billion, they are permanent members. Critics argue that this model replaces the legal right to self-determination within a conditional supervised existence. Effectively, this is commodifying the peacemaking process and placing it under the direct control of a single family organization. The board's executive members include Jared Kushner, Donald J. Trump, Marco Rubio, further cementing the perception that the BOP is an extension of the Trump family business interests. Corruption, people. Wake up and see it. When we look at the Arctic Renaissance, awareness, ownership, and the economic opportunity, we'll switch over to that. Now, the ironic twist of the geopolitical fate is the unprecedented attention directly at Greenland by the U.S. administration and the fact that it has significantly increased global awareness of the Arctic's importance. And that also has had an impact on Canada's north. Rather than facilitating an American takeover, the crisis has further confirmed recognition of ownership by nations including Canada, Denmark, and Greenland as the entities were forced to assert our sovereign rights with renewed vigor. This has led to a surge in international investments and a robust growth in the Arctic tourism industry, bringing substantial financial benefits to the region. Next week, we're actually going to look at tourism and travel and investment in the north. That will include Canada's north in the Arctic, Northwest Territories, Yukon, Nunavut. We'll take a look at Greenland. We'll take a look at other nations, and we'll take a look at the tourism and how this has impacted it. Because the infrastructure modernization program in Greenland is valued at approximately $800 million to $1 billion. It has become a social locomotive for development. The opening of the Nuuk International Airport in 2024, followed by upgrades at other airports, has connected Greenland directly to North American and European gateways for the first time ever. This access is expected to transform the local economy, with annual passenger traffic projected to reach 500,000 people by 2030. This is compared to just 40,000 people in 2023. When we look at Canada's north, now I don't have the 2025 statistics, but I do know that in 2024, in the second quarter, Canada's Arctic saw a major surge and a record high foreign tourists visiting the regions. That is non-domestic tourism that is being attracted at record levels to Canada's north as well. This is a prime opportunity to not only increase tourism and infrastructure and ports and look at the Northwest Passage for a shipping route, but it is a time to ensure that the sovereignty of the Arctic is recognized and that it is secured for generations to come. Now, let's take a look at this again. Now, the project for Greenland was the airport. The 2023 baseline for tourism there was 40,000 approximately. The 2030 projection is between 300 and 500,000 people. The direct connectivity of the airlines to the region for people to experience, whether it's the Arctic here in Canada or in Greenland. The unique experiences that can be had by individuals, by families, by groups is unheard of. With the opening of all of these opportunities, it also is looking at the different areas because annual tourist arrivals, with the diversification of the GDP beyond fisheries in Greenland, is going from about 140,000 to 200 to 300,000. When you look at the cruise passengers in 2024, it was approximately 95,000. And that is significantly going to increase. And it also will see the growth of infrastructure for turn ports and shore operations. Hotel rooms is one of the problems that they have in Greenland. There's a scarcity of hotels there. However, they are looking at the numbers and they figure they want to put in, or what's required would be at least 3,200 hotels. Again, creating jobs, investment, building, and further solidifying the sovereignty and the claims that Greenland and the Greenlandic people should be guiding and directing their future. When you look at the 3,200 hotel rooms that are required, you're looking at an investment of about $750 million. That's construction equity coming in. Now, at this time, of course, one of the biggest primary revenue sources for Greenland is the fisheries export value. And that, again, with the enhancements to the infrastructure and everything else, it's going to enhance the value for fresh versus frozen exports. Huge, huge benefits. The Greenland Renaissance is also visible in the diplomatic sphere. To protect Greenland's sovereignty against unilateral U.S. actions, several nations, including Canada, France, and others, have announced the opening of consulates in Nuuk or are considering it. These steps are widely viewed as an effort to internationalize Greenland's status, making it more difficult for any power to alter its sovereignty without triggering a multi-state crisis. Furthermore, the Danish government has allotted $1.6 billion of local currency for welfare infrastructure and health investments in Greenland, reinforcing the well-oiled cooperation between Nuuk and Copenhagen as a direct response to American pressure. When we look at the global realignment, ladies and gentlemen, the retreat from American hegemony, now, the world's political leaders have reached a significant turning point in their handling of the U.S. administration. The 2026 Greenland crisis has spurred a growing movement to turn their back on the United States until a stable leader returns to the White House. Even then, the question will remain whether or not the world is going to see the U.S. as a stable option and business partner, security partner, and other benefits that we've seen for decades. Or is it going to be a point of trying to repair the damage done by Trump, only to see in a couple of terms another person able to come into the U.S., take control as the president, and screw it all over again? It's been decades of building the relationships and the partnerships, and yet it's taken less than a year for Trump to totally screw it up and destroy it. French President Emmanuel Macron and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney have been at the forefront of this shift, emphasizing that the rules-based order is fading and that the world must transition to a system where international law is no longer trampled underfoot by the strongest. This realignment is a manifest in the emergence of an explicit European Arctic coalition and the Europeanization of security in Greenland. Allies are now engaging in contingency planning that treats the U.S. as a rogue ally, with the long-term damage to U.S. credibility serving as a warning to all other nations. The era of placating the administration has been replaced by a strategy of deterrence, economic retaliation, and institutional hedging. Let's not forget, if you have not seen the statement and the speech by Mark Carney in Davos, I encourage you to tune it in and watch every minute of it. It was written by Carney. He had some input from advisors, but he wrote that speech. And he took the time to make sure that it was articulate, that it was on point, and that it delivered a very, very clear message that even Trump could understand. And we know it got into Trump's head because he brought it up the following day when he arrived in Davos and started to make his speech. We know that Carney got into his head. Now, key statements from the International Stability Movement here in Davos, or there in Davos. Number one, as I said, Mark Carney. He was quoted as saying, "Every day we are reminded the rules-based order is fading. The strong can do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they must." Huge statement. Emmanuel Macron of France said that it's as well a shift towards a world without rules where international law is trampled underfoot. Matt Fredriksson from Denmark stated discussions about Denmark's sovereignty were off the table. Period. Aja Shemnitz Larsen, and I hope I didn't kill your name too bad. My apologies if I did, but from Greenland said, "Nothing about us without us." Very to the point. There's nothing about us without us. Great statement. Very few words, but very, very powerful. And then you had Mark Rutte, or Rutt, depending on how you want to pronounce it. He was quoted as saying, "For the United States to stay safe, you need a safe Arctic. We are working completely integrated." Excuse me. Excuse me. Sorry, folks. I have deep concerns about where Mark Rutte is. He's trying to play the diplomat, but at the same time, he's not publicly holding the U.S. government and Donald Trump to account for their actions and their statements and their threats to NATO itself. It must be stated clearly and unequivocally that we don't treat partners around the world as disposable, especially after 80 years of building those relationships. To insult them, to degrade them, to penalize them financially and try to destroy them in terms of the economics is not how a world will move forward towards peace, security, safety, and of course, stability for our future generations. The world must stop entertaining the demands of a posture that treats sovereign nations as transactional assets. The Greenland crisis has proven that when allies stand together, whether through military exercises like Operation Arctic Endurance or economic solidarity, the imperial ambitions of a single leader can be contained. However, the institutionalization of this approach through the Board of Peace poses a long-term threat that requires a sustained and principled rejection by the global community. In closing up tonight's show, folks, let's take a look here. Let's conclude this as the Arctic being the final frontier of the rules-based order. The historical evolution of Arctic sovereignty has faced its most severe test in 2026. The Trump administration's attempt to annex Greenland was not merely a strategic maneuver, but a complex tapestry of domestic deflection and pacification of adversarial powers like Russia and a bid for long-term global control through the Board of Peace. However, the unintended consequences of this aggression has been to revitalize the economy and the interest of the Arctic's own sense of identity and ownership. Greenland and its neighbors have emerged from the crisis with a stronger infrastructure, increased tourism, and more unified diplomatic front. The same can be said for Canada's Arctic. The recognition of sovereignty by nations like Canada and Denmark is now reinforced by a permanent NATO presence and a global awareness of the region's vital importance. As the world turns its back on the transactional foreign policy of the current U.S. executive, the Arctic stands as a testament to the resilience of the rules-based order when faced with the deranged pressures of a 21st century power politics. The Board of Peace may attempt to redefine the world order, but the sovereign people of the North have already declared that their land and their future is not for sale. Once again, folks, if you have been watching, we invite you to leave your comments down below. Let us know your thoughts on this topic or any other topic you would like to see us cover. Next week, we will be talking tourism and travel to not only Canada's north, but also to places such as Greenland and Norway and other places that have been in the spotlight as a result of Trump's maniac behavior. We'll take a look at how this could actually help to develop the economic stability that they need for their future. Join us next week, Thursday, 8 o'clock Mountain Standard Time, on Jess FM and Jess TV. I am James Cousineau. Thank you for tuning in this week, folks. Take care and stay safe.